Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our IOSH Southeast webinar, Shift Work and the Impact on Wellbeing. My name is Julian Mills, and I'm your branch chair. Our speaker today is Helen Lawson. Helen has a varied career spanning business, education, and health, and she acquired a psychology BSc and certificate in education along the way. Wellbeing Training Solutions is the culmination of the knowledge and skills developed from her diverse experiences. Having become increasingly aware that many people were surviving rather than thriving in the work and personal lives, Helen sought to change that by upskilling people on topics including resilience, stress management, managing difficult conversations, communication skills, smoking cessation, cardiovascular health, and behavioural change. Helen's approach is informal, interactive and practical, with a determination not to just increase knowledge, but to equip people to really do things differently and reap the rewards. So, without any further ado, over to you, Helen, and can you share your screen, please?
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, and I hope that you will enjoy the presentation. I will just share my screen with you so you can see my slides. There we go. So the session is about shift work and the impact on wellbeing. And there are a few objectives that I have from this session for you, that we'll talk about shift work in context and the key guidance that's available. And that's UK guidance that we'll be looking at, because I'm aware that we do have people joining us from all over the country and all over the world, in fact, this afternoon. We're going to look at the known negative impacts associated with shift work, and how to support shift workers using a wellbeing framework. So I'm well aware that all of you will be far more expert in the health and safety aspect of shift work than I am, because I'm not a health and safety expert, I'm not a shift work expert, but I am a specialist in wellbeing. So what I'm hoping to do is pull the two worlds together and provide a framework that could really help you to support your people and the demands that put on them through shift work. And also to look at the benefits of getting wellbeing right for shift workers, for other workers as well, because I'm aware that some of you will be joining us not necessarily having an overwhelming need to look at wellbeing from the point of view of shift work, but there is nothing really that I will talk about this afternoon that wouldn't be applicable to a wider workforce as well. So that's the aim for the session. And I thought it would be useful to start with a little summary or recap in case anybody with us isn't quite sure about what shift work really is. And the reality is that there is no one specific definition. It would generally be considered to be work which is outside standard hours, maybe with a handover of some description. And standard hours are normally considered to be between 7 AM and 7 PM, a shift of about 8 hours with a lunch break. It could also be where one employer replaces another on the same job in a 24-hour period. And it might be where somebody is working extended periods of 12 hours or more, rotating shifts, having split shifts, and even on overtime, standby and on-call. So in terms of how big an issue that is, well, there are approximately 3.6 million shift workers in the UK at the moment. That's 14%, or about a seventh of the working population. So it's not an inconsiderable number of people that we're talking about at all. And there are really specific problems that come with shift work, so it's important that we try and get it right for them. Now, there is a whole range of guidance and regulations available to do with shift work, which I'm not going to talk through, but I will just say that the second bullet point here, the Managing Shift Work Health and Safety Guidance from the HSE, was one of my main sources in terms of the issues faced by shift workers. And I would suggest if you want any more information about the guidance available, these would be the ports of call for you to go to. And having covered that, then we get on to my bag, having covered your bag. So what is wellbeing? Well, wellbeing is something which has become quite muddied recently. It can be anything from a free fruit Friday right the way through to psychological support. So it really covers a whole range of things. But the definition of wellbeing that I think works very well is, first of all, that it's subjective. So what is wellbeing for me may not be wellbeing for you. It is entirely different from person to person, but it is about one's state of mind. Generally speaking, it will be about being comfortable, healthy and happy over a period of time. And the period of time is really important because there's a big difference between being happy and having good well-being. You can be happy momentarily within a period of having poor well-being. So we mustn't get confused that it's just happiness. It's actually much more than that. It's also not the absence of illness or disease. It's not just that. You will find some people, and I'm sure if you cast your mind around people that you know, you will have come across people who have illness or disease, but also seem to have a wonderful sense of well-being. They just are very positive people. And equally, you will almost certainly have come across people who have no illness or disease, and yet they can't seem to harness that sense of well-being that all of us really would strive for. Well-being can be physical, it can be mental, and the terminology about mental well-being is another thing that is becoming increasingly confused and a little bit lost. So to really help you with that, if there's any confusion, I would suggest you think about the fact that we all have mental well-being or mental health all of the time. We all have some level of mental health all of the time. We do not all have mental illness. So there is a very stark distinction for some people between mental health and mental illness, and that's worth bearing in mind. So I'm just going to ask you to reflect momentarily. This is a brave new world, as we all know, where we're doing things online, and I would normally be in a room full of people with lots of engagement, and I think that that engagement is still really important. So I would just ask you to reflect on your own well-being for a moment. And on a scale of 1 to 10, where your well-being is as bad as you could possibly imagine, and 10 being the best you can possibly imagine, where would you put your well-being at the moment? And that's a really helpful little check-in to do every now and again, to just think about where you are and what the common denominators might be in terms of whether you are feeling great or not so great. So now that you've had a little think about yourself, I want you to start thinking about your organisations, because that's why you're here. So levels of wellbeing intervention. There are 3 levels of wellbeing intervention to be used within an organisation. First of all, we have primary interventions on wellbeing. And primary interventions are really the bit of wellbeing that are woven through the fabric of an organisation. So it incorporates the business design, the business organisation, how all your policies and processes are set up. And it's the primary intervention because really it's the most important, and it's the one that we want people to focus on. It eliminates or reduces stress and negative wellbeing impacts at source. So for example, with shift work, when you look at how shift work is organised in your organisation, what you would be trying to do with a primary level of intervention is to say, right, how can we work out our shift work, our hours, the actual organisation of the shifts, breaks, so that we eliminate as much stress and negative wellbeing as possible. That's primary intervention. We then have secondary intervention, which is more targeted. So the primary stuff is really at organisational level. You're looking at a whole organisation to help everybody get the benefits. The secondary level is more targeted to specific groups of people. So if you had, for example, a group of workers who you knew were continually undertaking a very monotonous and repetitive task, and it wasn't possible to eliminate or reduce that through your primary intervention, then you can start to undertake some secondary intervention. And secondary interventions are normally training based. So it will be, okay, how can we train and support our staff to deal with the unhelpful things that we're not able to eliminate? That could extend to things like coping mechanisms. It could be to do with training them on their own health or how to communicate with others. But again, secondary, very much targeted towards groups or individuals where we can't eliminate the stresses. And it is about what we can't do, we will try and overcome with some training. And finally, we've got tertiary levels of wellbeing or tertiary interventions. And these are the least desirable to be aiming for in many ways, because it means that our primary and our secondary haven't really been effective. So tertiary interventions, things like counselling. They're often provided by employee assistance programs. And if you're not familiar with employee assistance programs, that's where an organisation buys in a service, often from an external organisation who specialise in everything from training to 24-hour manager helplines to counselling, either face-to-face and on the telephone for staff. So if we're at the situation where you're needing to do the really targeted tertiary interventions to provide people with counselling for work-related stress, that suggests that the primary and secondary stuff hasn't been very effective. And the tertiary stuff really should only be there as an add-on to those first two. It is our last line of defence rather than first line of defence. So now we've considered a little bit about what wellbeing really is and what organisations can do about it, we'll have a look at what the specific responsibilities are for employers around supporting shift workers and managing shift work. So the first thing is that they really need to protect the health, safety and welfare of all of their employees and others. So yes, you need to look after your shift workers, but you need to look after everybody else as well, as you know much better than I do. And whether it's the public or service users also. You would need to carry out assessments of the risks related to their shift work, and you would need to consult with employees about the shift work that they're undertaking, and especially if there are going to be any changes. And then the organisation needs to commit to measures which reduce risks, including the number of hours that people work and how those hours are scheduled. And I said at the beginning that health and safety and shift work is probably much more your bag and wellbeing is probably much more my bag. So from this slide, I imagine that for many of you, most of this will be fairly routine, but I would like to pick up on the third bullet point, which says consult with employees, because I think this is something that can so easily be gotten very wrong. So as an employer or as the person responsible for health and safety in your organisation, there is an opportunity here. And that opportunity is to think about, if you do consult with your staff and when you are leading your staff, whether that's to do with shift work or anything else, that the effectiveness of that consultation really comes down to the skill of the person leading it. And I love this quote. I use it all the time in my health improvement work that I do in public health. The wise man doesn't give the right answers, he poses the right questions. And I think if you try and imagine instances where you have been working with people and perhaps thinking about a message that you want to get across to somebody, but you're greeted with closed questions or presumptive questions, you'll often find that you don't get a chance to explain your own issues particularly well. And that's why the posing of questions is so important. So if you're involved in consultation or if you're leading a group of people, if you have the opportunity to upskill in how you ask great questions, that can really give you an insight and get under the skin of the issues that people are facing. Because certainly in terms of health and safety, it's the unknowns that are the greatest danger. And if we don't ask questions in such a way that give people the opportunity to speak freely and give detail, that can be a problem for an organisation and certainly for the people that are working with you. And then once you've asked the great questions, and there might be many of them, then we get on to thinking about how do you listen to the answers that you get. And you might be aware that there are 5 forms of listening broadly talked about, or a ladder of listening. And that ladder starts at the bottom here. This is adapted from some work by Stephen Covey, who wrote a fantastic book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which I'll reference again later on. And at the bottom of the ladder of listening is ignoring. And I wonder how many of you at this moment in time are thinking, yes, I've been there and I've been saying something to somebody and I know they're not listening. And I wonder how many of you are also thinking, I'm in week whatever, 3000 of lockdown, I'm homeschooling, I'm dealing with 1,000 things at once, I'm getting really good at ignoring when I'm listening to. It's inevitable sometimes, and we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves with that. But in a work situation, if we're doing consultations, if we're asking people about the problems they have, we really need to make sure that we are not ignoring what we're being told. The next level up, slightly better than ignoring, is the pretending level. Those conversations that you will have had with people where you're listening, but you're maybe not really listening. So there's lots of mm-hms, yes, but you're really looking at your phone or you're typing away as that happens. People pick up on that and they know that you are pretending to listen rather than actually listening. So again, not very helpful. Then we've got selective listening. So you can see we're getting slightly more sophisticated in our techniques, but still far from ideal. And the selective listening is where we're listening for things that we want to hear. So yes, this is what I expect to hear, so this is what I'm going to pick up on. And if you've ever been in a situation with a line manager or a colleague where you know this is happening, where they aren't really hearing the full story, it's extremely frustrating, but also can be very damaging to the organisation because information is being lost that could be valuable. So the fourth level of listening is about being attentive. Now we're getting much better. We're getting much closer to where we want to be because we are actually paying attention to the words that the person we're speaking to are using. We're trying to listen to what's being said. But there's a key thing about these four levels of listening, and that's that they all tend to be quite autobiographical. And what I mean by that is that we're listening from our own point of view. So we're listening to it, trying to form a frame of reference that relates to us. And often we're listening in terms of being prepared to respond. But if you really want to listen to somebody, you shouldn't be listening to respond. You should be listening in order to understand. And that's where we get to the fifth and the highest level of listening, the one that we really want to be about, the one that can save your organisation a huge amount of trouble if you get it right when it comes to consulting, is the empathic level of learning, or listening rather, where you're really listening to what's being said from the individual's point of view, where you are paying attention not just to the words, but to body language. So ideally you'll be doing it face to face, that you're paying attention just as much to things that aren't said as you are to things that are said. And again, take a look at your organisations, take a look at your behaviour, the behaviour of the people that are leading your teams, and just ask yourself, is this the level of sophistication that we're at, or are we missing things because we may be slightly down that ladder of listening? But it's not a one-way street. When it comes to health and safety, there is always the employee responsibility as well. So in terms of shift work, employees have a responsibility to take reasonable care of their own and others' safety, to take positive steps to understand the risk factors in their work, including things like how fatigue affects them, their need to comply with safety rules, and that they must do nothing to put others at risk. And all of that sounds quite straightforward, but I'm sure some of you are imagining people that you are aware of who you think, well, actually, they don't do that. And this isn't a difficult thing we're asking of them, so why is it not happening? And I'd suggest you have a look at this model and see whether that might help you at all to understand why sometimes people don't do what you think is the simplest thing for them. This model is called the COM-B model, and it was created by a psychologist called Susan Michie, very prominent psychologist in the UK. You might see her at the moment. She's advising SAGE about the government's approach to the pandemic, and she's quite often featured on the news. And this model, I think, is a fantastically simple way to think about whether you've created the right environment for people to actually carry out their responsibilities. So the first thing is to ask yourself, does the person have the capability? Are they able to do what you're asking them to do? And if not, you can do a needs analysis and find out why not, and then provide some coaching or support for them so that they can reach the capability required in order to fulfill their responsibilities. Then ask yourself, are you providing them with the right opportunity? And by that, we're talking about culture, we're talking about environment, we're talking about listening when things aren't going well. And you can then add together their responsibility and your responsibility with capability and opportunity, and add that to motivation. So does the individual have the motivation to do the right thing in terms of looking at their responsibilities? And that motivation is either intrinsic, so it comes from within, that idea that we just want to do the right thing, or motivation might be extrinsic, so it's coming from outside, the carrot, if you like, or the incentive to do the right thing. And Susan Michie's COM-B model suggests that if you can get the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation all right together, then what that will add up to is the behaviour that you desire. And if you aren't getting the behaviour you desire, you might need to go back and see which of these is lacking somewhere. And then we've got some shift work negatives for businesses. Now, unfortunately, people aren't designed to do shift work, particularly nights. That's not how human beings were intended to work. So there are some negatives that can come about for businesses, albeit that shift work can be a necessary evil for businesses who just need to have shift work in order to perform what their customer needs or to be economical. Poor performance is the first, likelihood of errors is another, and accidents. These are all significant issues and negatives that come from shift work. And that can sound a little bit bleak. It sounds like shift work is one of those things that we kind of have to accept. There are all these things we're not happy about. But there are always opportunities. Wherever there are challenges, there are opportunities. And the first of them I would suggest is to make sure that you have and your organisation has adopted a growth mindset. And what I mean by that is that you have a belief and a conviction that everybody has the ability to learn, to do better, to do things differently in order to achieve desired results. So as human beings, we tend to fall into one of two camps. The first camp is the growth mindset, and I would put myself firmly in that bracket. It would be a nonsense to be a trainer and not have a growth mindset, because what would be the point in training people if you didn't believe that anything was going to change as a result? Then there's the other camp of people who have more of a fixed mindset. And that fixed mindset says, well, actually, you know, once I hit 20, 24, I think at about that age, I'm pretty much set for life. My attitudes, my abilities, my skills, that's pretty much where I'm going to stay. And that sort of fixed mindset can be really damaging for business because it means that opportunities aren't being sought out. It can be really damaging for health and safety as well. And when we're looking at shift work, if we want things to be better for the individuals and for the organisation, we need to encourage everybody from the top down to have that growth mindset that things can be different and better. And I'd also ask you to think about marginal gains, which was an idea proposed by Dave Brailsford. You may recognise the name. He was the manager of the Great Britain cycling team, who obviously for a very long time did amazing things. I'm not a big fan often of using sporting analogies when it comes to business, because there is a big difference between sport, where people train extremely hard for long periods of time, for short bursts of performance where they have to be at their peak. That is a very different way of working to how most of us work in business. And in business, unfortunately, we don't get enormously long periods to train, but we are expected to perform at a consistently high level over a long period of time. So the analogies on sport are always slightly dubious, but Dave Brailsford had this idea of marginal gains, and it was magnificently successful for him. So marginal gains are this idea that actually you can achieve great things by having a cumulative effect of very small things. So his cycling team would do such small things as, whenever they were away from home training, each athlete would bring their own pillow with them, so that they were guaranteed a comfortable night's sleep, and then they would be able to perform better the next day. He also coached them on hand washing techniques, and how ahead of his time he was, we now know, because he realised that if people adopted the right hand hygiene, then they would be much less susceptible to bugs and germs, and therefore wouldn't be hit with unnecessary illnesses, and their performance could be better. And within your organisations, with shift workers, with all workers, you might well find that there are no massive issues, but there are a whole host of small things which, if done differently, could make a really big difference to your organisation. So think about what marginal gains you could get to. And in order to take that a little bit further, there are other things you can do to minimise businesses' negatives from shift work. You can start with the probably glaringly obvious, which is to review the organisational practices. So when we went back to our primary interventions on wellbeing, this is one of them. You can create a supportive infrastructure. So yes, you'll have your policy around shift work, but how are all your other policies? How is your leave policy? How is your pay structure? Think about whether those things could be changed or adapted to make the supportive infrastructure for your people a little bit better. Check your COM-B model. Do your people have the capability, the opportunity, and have you given them the motivation to carry out the behaviour that you would like? Leadership. I've talked already about listening skills, about asking the right questions. Do your leaders know their stuff or know their staff? There are an awful lot of people in leadership positions who are there because they know their job really well, and they know the job that their people are doing really well. But that is sadly not the same as knowing their staff. And they need to know their staff to be a good people manager and a good leader. Is competition an organisational tactic? Are you setting one person off against another? Because if you are, then in terms of well-being and in terms of performance, because the whole point of talking about well-being within a business is that people's well-being often equates to their performance. You will very rarely get a business where people are highly unhappy performing exceptionally well. And no matter what some managers might believe about, treating them mean and keeping them keen, is just not the case. And if you are setting people up to compete against each other, that sets up a mindset which says somebody has to fail. And actually what you want is people working creatively together in order to all be working towards the same common purpose. Have you created a shared vision and a community where people feel like they are in it together and that they are supportive of each other? And this is really important for shift workers who maybe pass somebody for 5 minutes and then that's it. So, do make sure that you have an absolute dedication to a shared vision and community. And have you given them psychological safety? That's really important. They need to feel secure. They need to feel that you are behind them, that their line manager is behind them, that there is no danger of them being harassed, abused, being the victim of any kind of bullying. And all of those things need to come from the top, but also encouraged from a bottom-up approach as well. So now we've looked at the business side of things. What about the individual negative impacts of shift work? Well, first of all, one of the main problems with shift work, particularly if we're looking at night work and things that happen outside that 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. shift, is the disruption to the circadian rhythms or the body clock. So circadian rhythms mean that people are designed, if you like, to be awake and functioning during the day, not at night. And our circadian rhythms mean that at night our blood pressure drops, our heart rate drops, our digestive system stops working as well, and our attention decreases. So circadian rhythms are hardwired into us. We can do nothing about them. And you need to be absolutely sure that people are aware that that's the case so that they don't feel like there's a weakness in them. Shift workers will often experience sleep disturbance or sleep loss, and that sleep disturbance comes because they're doing things in the middle of the night and then trying to sleep during the day when everybody else is leading their lives. And a continual ongoing impact of that sleep disturbance will be fatigue, where somebody becomes much less functional. People can have a disturbed appetite and digestion because, again, we're not designed to be eating at night time and sleeping during the day. And all of those things can have a negative impact of people having a reliance on sedatives and or stimulants in order to keep them awake during their working shift and to keep them asleep during the day. It's not hard to imagine then how that can lead to social and domestic problems as the stresses start to mount up. And inevitably, all of those things combined can then cause problems at work also. So what can be done to minimise the individual impacts, those impacts that are personal for people? Tell them about those negative impacts. Let them be aware of it. Knowledge really is power. And if people understand that these are the issues, they can try and manage them. Educate people on how to minimise those issues with things like sleep hygiene training, letting them know about the effects of alcohol, stimulants and sedatives. Explain their biology, let them know about these circadian rhythms, but also about the fact that they've got scarce neurological or cognitive resources. Our brains cannot cope with a huge amount of stuff at one time. The same area of the brain that deals with emotions can't be dealing with a complex task. So we need people to understand how to manage themselves better so that your organisation can get more from them. Highlight for them the significance of stress and how managing that is important. Because actually, in a recent study on sleep, for example, we all know how important sleep is and how not getting enough sleep can be very dangerous. But there is now evidence that actually says that people's worry about not getting sleep might be just as dangerous as the lack of sleep itself. So if we can help people to minimise those stressors, that's a really good start. And a general awareness for people about self-awareness, emotional intelligence, listening skills and constructive communication skills. If people can build those skill sets, then their performance at work improves, their stresses should reduce, and they should also be in a position to perform better and deliver you the sorts of results that you're looking for. And I'm just going to talk a little bit now about health inequalities. And health inequalities are unfair, avoidable differences across populations. So if we look, for example, at life expectancy, in England, the life expectancy for men in the most deprived area is 9.3 years less than the life expectancy for men in the most affluent area. And for women, it's 7.5 years. Now that is unforgivable in a advanced country, but that's where we are. And you might think, well, 9.3 years across the whole country, that's not so bad. But to give you an example, I live in Medway, which is a very small geographical area, just 74 square miles with a population of about 277,000 people. And in our area, the life expectancy difference for men is still 8.6 years and 7 years for women. And there are wider determinants of health. So it's about the fact that people's education, income, housing and employment affect their health equalities and their access to services and how long they're probably going to live. And people who are doing shift work will often be people from the routine and manual populations who will be experiencing these health inequalities. So it's absolutely essential that we think about whether they have lower awareness of and access to services that might be there and readily available for them, but they just need a little bit more support to get them. And this isn't a legal requirement, but you might perhaps consider it to be a moral or ethical obligation on the part of you and your organisation. And there's recently been a document released called the Skills Builder Framework, and links to some of these things that I'm talking about are at the end of the presentation, and you will get a copy of it at the end of the presentation. And that the Skills Builder Framework talks about 8 essential skills that people should be having when they leave school to thrive. So what are the specific health problems for shift workers then? We know now a bit about health inequalities and that routine and manual workers might be more susceptible, but specifically they're at more risk of things like gastrointestinal issues, things like indigestion and constipation. They can have hypertension and coronary heart disease, colds, flus, gastroenteritis. Interestingly, female reproductive issues are prominent, but the link isn't absolutely confirmed, not so much on the male side. And also shift work can affect people's pre-existing conditions. Things like diabetes and asthma can be damaged by doing shift work. A lot of people will not be aware that there is a dose-response effect of medications as well. So what that means is that their circadian rhythms work in conjunction with medications to help medication work well. And when people are doing shift work, those dose response don't work properly. So people need to be aware so that they can manage their own particular symptoms. So what can you do to support the shift workers' health? Well, you may or may not be aware that all organisations should be looking at the working time regulations and making sure that for some shift workers you need to provide free health assessments, and doing that if that's necessary. You can also continually promote what your organisation has available. So if you have an employee assistance programme, please do tell people about it. I go into organisations all the time to do training, and I ask them about their employee assistance programme, and they don't even know that it exists. So you really need to make sure that people are aware of what you have available. It won't sink in until the moment that they need it, so tell them regularly. Promote free resources. Are you aware that people can have NHS health checks, which are available for people aged 40 to 74 with no pre-existing cardiovascular diseases? And they can have that locally. It's a national initiative which is mandated, which means it has to be provided by local authorities. And people can go and get everything from their cholesterol to their blood pressure checked, and then get free support in order to make any changes they'd like to. So not everything has to cost money. Are you doing enough in terms of health promotion in your organisation? Last week was Men's Health Month, last week was Mental Health Week. This week is Cervical Screening Week. Are you promoting these things which can be done quickly and efficiently? And if you are, then making your staff more aware means that they should stay healthier, and that should give you good results in terms of less absenteeism, less ill health, and generally a better feeling population. Do they understand the basics of how blood pressure works and what their options are for stopping smoking? Again, if you've got a large proportion of routine and manual staff, it may well be that they just don't understand what's available. Things like vaping. Can I, should I, what should I do? Educate people on self-care and health management. And give physical and mental health parity of esteem. So that means that you consider both to be equally important, that you're not concentrating just on physical health or just on health and safety, but really about the overall well-being of your people. And you can help people to arrive at good conclusions for themselves by training them on different ways to think. So in terms of their mental well-being, and again, I made the distinction at the beginning that we are talking mental well-being or mental health, not mental illness, which is a diagnosed condition and is much more complex. But for their well-being, give them some thinking strategies. So you can see here that we've got 3 circles. The inner circle, the green circle, is your circle of control. So that's everything in your world that you can actually control. And I hate to break it to you all, but that isn't very much. It's pretty much you and your response to things. Outside that, the yellow circle is your circle of influence. So that's the things that you can't control, like maybe your kids and your co-workers. You can't control them, but you can certainly have some influence over them, and hopefully a positive influence in that. And then the final outside circle, the red circle, is your circle of concern, or I would rather call it my circle of acceptance, because actually all that stuff I can do nothing about, and neither can you. So the fact that there is a global pandemic, we can't do anything about it. The fact that we might not like how the government are dealing with it, we can't do anything about it. And if we understand those circles and we can bring our attention back to our circle of control and our circle of influence, it gives us a real feeling of control and of being empowered and concentrating on those things that we can affect rather than the things that we can't. And we can then deal with our circle of acceptance. So with shift workers, so you might be able to explain to them about what they can control and influence in their working environment, and help them to accept those things that they can't, so that their efforts, attention and energy get focused in the right areas. Then we've got stuff about positive change. And this is a model that's taken from CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy. But again, if you want to support people to think differently and to think more positively so that they get personal benefits, but the business benefits as well, this is how you can do that. So people can think about things. Let's take the pandemic as an example. For some people, when the pandemic hit and we were put in lockdown, their thoughts were, I am trapped in my house, I'm being treated like a prisoner. And I think we'd all agree that's a pretty negative way of thinking. And there is a way to flip that, which we'll talk about in a moment. But if you're thinking really negatively and you're thinking that you're stuck and you've got no choices, I mean, staff need to know there's always choices. They might not like them, but there are always choices. But those negative thoughts will lead to negative feelings. Feelings of being low, feeling isolated, feeling unhappy. And those feelings will often lead to behaviours. So whether that is constantly trotting off to the fridge to find something to eat, or maybe pouring a glass of wine a little bit too early in the evening, we get this triangle of thoughts, feelings and behaviours that feed off each other. So whether it's a thought, a feeling or behaviour, if you have a negative thought, feeling or behaviour, it will often lead to more negative thoughts, feelings and behaviours, and you can go into a downward spiral. But at any time you can intervene in that triangle and say, well, actually there is a different way. So instead of thinking about being trapped in your home, being like a prisoner, in the pandemic, the positive way to look at that is, I've been allowed to stay safe in my sanctuary where I'm protected from the dangers outside. That creates much more positive feelings and hopefully much more positive behaviours, and can in turn lead to an upward spiral, which is more positive for individuals and for organisations. So the benefits we've got about supporting shift workers' wellbeing are that if we do it well, then sickness and absenteeism, including lost time incidents, are likely to reduce. Accidents should reduce, compensation claims reduce, efficiency improves, quality improves, productivity improves, performance improves, engagement improves, and that's engagement with your organisation. And if people are engaging well with your organisation, they're probably also going to be talking about you well outside the organisation. And in today's world where social media is everything, that's really important. You want people to be talking positively about your organisation. And finally, something I haven't touched on yet, but which is extremely important, which is discretionary effort. The evidence out there suggests that for most people, and this might not be the case in your organisation, in your role, but for many people, they feel that if they work at 30% of their capacity, just 30% of their capacity, they can get away with it. And I have definitely worked in places where that is the case. And at 30% of capacity, they feel they can get away without being disciplined, and they can get away without having action taken against them that would put their job in jeopardy. Organisations should be aiming for people to work at about 80%. No more than 80%, because the danger is that we then get into positions of burnout and the 12 stages of burnout, which are, can be desperately unpleasant. And again, very expensive for businesses if somebody goes off long-term sick with burnout. So you've got a 50% margin there between the 30% that many people feel they can get away with and the 80% that you should be hoping to receive from them. And everything you do to enhance their well-being and their feel-good factor at work means that they're likely to give you that added bit of discretionary effort. So it is well worth organisations looking at what they can do to improve well-being, because that will improve business profitability, performance, and the really positive thing is the feeling of their people. So what does that mean? If we try and bring it all together now, what does that mean for your organisation? If you're looking to think about putting in place a workplace wellbeing strategy, there are 4 fundamental elements of a workplace wellbeing strategy that you need. I'm going to start in the bottom left-hand corner with money, which is something that I've only really touched on, but money is why we all go to work, really. And if your people aren't being fairly rewarded financially, then fiscal well-being is going to be a concern. And what's really important to remember about the 4 aspects that I'm going to talk about here are that they are all interwoven. So if somebody's financial circumstances are bad, it's unlikely that that isn't going to have an effect on the other 3 elements of this square. So money is important, but I haven't laboured on it today, but it's something to think about. We then need to be thinking, if we go up from that, about their psychological well-being, their mind. So things like their psychological safety, their relationship with their line manager. We would then think about their physical safety, and as health and safety people, you know that already. So their physical safety is really important, but can you go above and beyond the preventative stuff and do something even more proactive and more holistic for people about their physiological well-being? And the final element is the community stuff. And the community stuff is, what are we going to do to help people feel like they belong? That sense of belonging that comes from the common purpose. And for shift workers, particularly when they're working different hours to their colleagues, how do you find a time to bring everybody together and really make them feel like part of the team? Because those are the 4 elements that are required to have a really effective workplace wellbeing strategy. And if you get them right, then you should really get that fundamental change that you might be hoping for. So in summary, to pull it all together, shift work poses real risks which have to be managed, and there is no denying that. There's no pretending that they aren't there. But for every challenge, there really is an opportunity. But you might just need to perhaps have a chat to somebody about how you can achieve that, look at some best practice and see what can be done. Look to achieve those marginal gains that Dave Brailsford had with the England or the British cycling team. What tiny things can you change to give an overall benefit? Consider the value of a wellbeing approach. If you haven't got an organisational wellbeing strategy, then think about doing it. But don't stop at the strategy. It has to lead into action. And then this is the old problem. We always get asked this question: what if I invest in this and then people leave? And that can happen because if you help people to feel better about themselves, that also opens opportunities. But whenever asked that question, the obvious answer, for me anyway, is that what if you invest in them and they leave? Yes, that's the danger. But the bigger danger is what if you don't invest in them and they stay? And that is the end of my presentation. Apologies once again for my power outage throughout, which I had to go and resolve. And I'm now willing to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Helen. I was aware personally. I was aware of many of the elements you covered, but hadn't really pulled them all together as you did, and it was good to have the explanations and examples. The other thing I particularly liked was the team approach when you were covering what can be done. You know, it's not just the employer; the employee does have some responsibility as well. First question here, Helen, is who would I think that should be how would an organisation's behaviours affect the employee's well-being in terms of doing shift work, and how do you reverse such an approach? I mean, I think you touched on some of it. For instance, with the you know, an organisation might encourage competition, which is not good. Is there anything else you would like to sort of highlight?
I think really it's that holistic approach. So looking at your organisation, your structures and how everything is set up. So if we go back to that primary, secondary and tertiary interventions, a lot of businesses will ask someone like me to come in and do training for them around training staff how to cope with resilience and so on. Well, that's great, and I'm always happy to do it, and people normally get a lot out of it. But the most powerful thing you can do is go back and look at how your organisation is set up and see whether there are things you can do differently in order to eliminate or reduce the causes of stress and the problems that shift workers encounter. And only then move on to the training, and only then move on to the counselling and other strategies after that.
Okay, so another interesting one here. When assessing wellbeing risks at the workplace, do you assess other areas apart from the work environment and the employees?
I think, I suppose this is where I think wellbeing is a little bit different to health and safety in general, because with health and safety, it is about assessment of risk. Whereas with wellbeing, I would say it's less about assessment of risk and more about what can we do to make things better. So you're not necessarily eliminating risks with wellbeing, but you're trying to create the most preferential environment and culture where people are free from all the concerns that can come with being in a workplace in terms of that psychological safety that I come back to again and again. If you can try and foster that feeling of being part of something and all working to a common goal, then it's a more positive approach, if you like. It's about doing things that will make people feel better rather than eliminating risks.
Okay. And someone's asked here about offering health assessments. Is this an obligation or good practice?
So the health assessments that I referred to, you'd need to take a look at the working time regulations to find out whether your organisation needs to provide health assessments for staff, depending on what shift work they do. Some organisations will have to provide them, some won't. So it's not an obligation for all organisations, but some shift workers will need to have them provided. But I would say in terms of just common sense, if you're in the UK, make people aware of things like the free NHS health check that they can have, which is at no cost to your organisation. If you work in a big organisation, you might even contact your local authority and see whether they would come into your organisation and carry out the free NHS health check. If you've got a routine and manual population, local authorities want to carry out these checks because they want to prevent disease, and this is how they do it. So again, I think I've provided the link at the end about NHS health checks for people to take a look. But you've got the kind of the moral obligation stuff, which is, well, it's not going to cost me a lot to tell them about it and it's free. But then in terms of the legal obligation, that will depend on your own organisation and what shift work is happening.
Okay. What about small and medium-sized enterprises? I mean, they don't have the same level of resource as the bigger companies. Is there some simple advice you'd be able to give them to help them improve their well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are things available free of charge again. There is a healthy workplace scheme which is run by I think there's a national initiative, and certainly in the local authorities run it as well, where they can come in and support organisations to deliver a healthy workplace. So they would run through things like your policies and procedures and make sure that you have the opportunities to put things in place to support your people. And people can, organisations then get awards, I think bronze, silver, gold and platinum level awards, if I'm not mistaken, depending on the level to which they commit to support their staff. I don't think I've actually added that to the end of the presentation, but I will find that for you and post it out to you, Julian, so that you can share that with people. So that's a great starting point for people, is the free government resources.
Excellent, thank you very much. Someone's asked about the shift rotations here. Now, you talked on the shift patterns, and I think what they're asking here is they're saying the studies show it's best to start with the earlies, then go to the lates, and then nights. Staff prefer the earlies, nights, lates.
Yeah,
more time off and long weekends.
I think on that one, I'm not familiar with that research. What I can tell you is that in terms of one's circadian rhythms, they take a long time for somebody to adjust, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. So if somebody's doing a week of one, then a week of another, and a week of another, then realistically their body is not going to adjust. And even people who do permanent nights, their bodies never fully adjust. But I'm a great believer that people are experts in themselves. So I would suggest that by all means be mindful of that, the research that you've looked at, which is always really important, but go back to the consultation and ask your people what is it they want and why. If for a business, I understand that there are two things here. Yes, they might want a certain thing, but that might not be what's delivering the best results for your business. So that will be a balancing act. But people very often are the experts in themselves in what works for them. So I would go back to them.
Okay. There's sorry, I'm having to filter them out here. What's the best approach to assess an employee's well-being or mental health at the workplace?
There is actually, there's again some online stuff and a free resource available. So I will post that on as well, Julian. So we can just add it onto the last slide where I've added the resources. But people can do an audit of their own working environment and the kind of stress levels. And that's well worth asking people to do. But the only thing I would urge caution on is if you're going to do that, be prepared to commit to doing something about it. And also, lots of organisations do their own employee surveys, which I'm a great fan of. I think they're really valuable, but they're only valuable if you do something with it, because there's almost nothing worse than raising an expectation with people that you are going to do something differently with their answers, and then you get the answers and nothing changes. That just leads to animosity and frustration. So there are a couple of good resources and I'll forward those on.
Okay, here's a good question, I think. I think I probably know the answer, but do you think that we need a big shift in culture with current working practices that seem to have a negative effect on overall well-being?
Yeah, I mean, the question has really written my answer, absolutely. I think we all need to take a long, hard look, not just actually, you know, again, I think we've all got some personal accountability for this. So organisations definitely need to be talking about wellbeing. And if this pandemic has done anything, I think it has really put wellbeing up the agenda. So the pandemic has made people think about wellbeing, that's great. But as we transition and go through this adaptation, stabilisation, more adaptation and stabilisation, I think we need to make sure that the gains that we have received during lockdown are sustained, and that we then try and be a bit more proactive about them going forward. But we as individuals also desperately need to take that accountability for managing our own time, having our boundaries, speaking up when there are issues, and helping to drive forward that change.
Okay, we do have some more questions here, but we're running short on time now. We've also had quite a number of people write in thanking you for the presentation, Helen, and saying they found it really beneficial.
Oh, lovely, thank you. So
it just leaves me to thank you again for taking the time out to give us this presentation. So thank you all very much for attending, and hope we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks very much.